Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's CID Speaker Series. My name is Carrie Ann DiBattista. I'm a second-year public policy student at the Harvard Kennedy School and a student ambassador for the Center for International Development at Harvard University. I'll be moderating today's discussion on social norms as a barrier to women's employment in developing countries. And the format for today's session is a 20 to 25-minute presentation and around 20 minutes for Q&A. Before we get started, a few housekeeping items to go over. During the Q&A session, you can submit questions directly in the chat or use the raise hand function. We are also recording today's session. The video of this event will be available on the CID YouTube channel. We'll add links to the chat to sign up for our newsletter and social media channels to hear more about research and upcoming events at CID. And our next speaker series is on Friday, December 3rd at 12 p.m. with the Chief Impact Officer at Harambee Youth Employment Accelerator in conversation with CID and World Bank expert Eliana Carranza. The discussion will focus on inclusive employment for South African youth, and we hope to see you guys there. But without further ado, I'd like to briefly introduce our speaker for today, Seema Jayachandran. Seema is a professor of economics at Northwestern University, and her research focuses on environmental conservation, gender equality, health, and other microeconomic topics in developing countries. She serves on the board of directors at the Abdul Latif Jameel Poverty Action Lab, or JPAL, and also leads JPAL's gender sector. She's also an alumna with a PhD in economics from Harvard University, and we're so happy to have her with us today. So thank you all for being here, and Seema, over to you.
Thanks very much, Carrie, for the introduction. I'm going to go ahead and share my slides. So I'm happy to be talking to you today about female employment in developing countries and the role of social norms and what that means for policy. Okay, so I'm going to start with this figure that is showing you the level of female employment in different countries versus on the horizontal axis their GDP per capita. And you can see there's not a always increasing relationship or an always decreasing relationship between a country's income and its female employment rate. And in fact, you can recognize this figure as from the Economist, but it's drawing this best fit curve, which is a U-shaped curve. And there's a lot of, it's a sort of famous canonical view of what happens to female employment over the course of development, where it is very much related to economic development, but in a more complicated way than always good or always bad. And the most of the U-shape is related to changes in the structure of the economy, that at very early stages of economic development, most work is agriculture or other work that's tied to the home. And so for women, if women are responsible or mostly responsible for child rearing and other home production or chores, then balancing those two roles of working kind of in the marketplace or non-home work, like working on the farm, and doing the domestic chores can be balanced because they're just physically adjacent to each other. But then with development, as jobs move away from homes to factories or offices, then it's harder to balance, and women might specialize more in home production. And so that would represent the decrease. And then, with further economic development, a lot more jobs require brains rather than brawn. We have a service-focused economy where physical strength isn't as important, and women then start to have relatively higher earning capacity. And so they're kind of the money you're leaving on the table if women don't work is becoming larger. And so that would explain the increase. And so I think this is, an interesting, and there's certainly something to this. And if you plot the best fit line, you indeed get this U shape. But for me, when I see this curve or kind of hear this discussion, what's most striking to me about this figure isn't the best fit line, but how poorly it fits. How much variation there is among countries at the same level of development. Ethiopia is a little bit poorer than Bangladesh on this figure, but it has considerably higher female employment, or India and Vietnam. So there's something that isn't about the structure of their economies that's explaining this variation among middle income and low income countries in terms of their female employment. And there are a lot of other things that can be going on, and so that in itself doesn't say, what explains it. But what I'm going to talk about today is the role of social norms, or specifically gender norms, varying across countries and being part of the explanation. So I think another figure that starts to hint that social norms might be part of what's explaining that variation is if we just look at a map of where female employment is high versus low. And you can see that the brown shades are the countries with particularly low female employment rates. And they're not randomly scattered around the world. There's very much a geographic clustering of them. And it includes both richer countries and poorer countries. So South Asia, the Middle East, and North Africa are the parts of the world with the lowest female employment rates. And so, it might be just a coincidence that that those countries have low female employment rate, but I think you want to look to things. A parsimonious explanation would be looking to things that set of countries has in common, and just sort of thinking about the world and different societies. I'm not an expert on all of these countries, but these are all countries that are known for having relatively restrictive gender norms, above and beyond female employment, but that would in turn affect women's employment. And so that's kind of a starting point to say that there's some circumstantial evidence that social norms are important for female employment. If we're trying to explain variation around the world, there's a lot of variation in norms across countries at the same level of development. And when I say social norms or gender norms, there are a bunch of different norms, and most of these norms are relevant in all societies to one degree or another. So when we look at those countries with low female employment rates, it's not that they're the only ones with these norms. It's just that they happen to be maybe more restrictive. And so I think some of the norms that are relevant is just a stigma from women being the family breadwinner, just a view that it's men's role, and that men would feel challenged or upset if their wife was earning more than them or was a major contributor as a breadwinner to the family. There are also just restrictions on women's social interactions and mobility. And that's probably the norm that I think is strongest, or relatively stronger in the North Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia compared to other parts of the world. But where to protect women's chastity or kind of some ideas of purity, there are restrictions on who women can socialize with and who they can interact with. And obviously, if women are out in the workplace, there's going to be less control over who they can interact with. There's also norms around how acceptable it is to harass women in public spaces. So laws and policies matter for this too, but there's also just sort of what other people think is acceptable. And that's going to affect women if, as they're commuting, or if some of those norms are true in the workplace as well. There are also differences across societies in who controls household finances and who makes decisions about how to spend money. And that's relevant because one of the personal returns to working is if it confers more power in making decisions. Different people, even in a family, are going to have slightly different preferences, or maybe very different preferences. And if, for example, women are not getting to have a lot of say over how much they're over spending, even if they're bringing in a lot of money, their personal incentive to work outside the home is going to be smaller. And then finally, a norm that is certainly a worldwide gender norm is who has primary responsibility for household chores and childcare. And I think it's quite obvious that that's women everywhere in the world, and therefore that's going to disadvantage women in the labor market. And when I say in the labor market, I both mean how much you're working, so female employment, the rate of female employment, which is what I showed on the previous figures, but also just earning capacity once you're working, because if you might be able to work full time, but maybe not a job that requires you to be on call on evenings, if you're responsible for childcare. And some of those jobs where you're on call in the evenings might be particularly lucrative ones. And I should also say here that, when we're thinking about female employment, I think it's important just for broader concepts or broader concerns about gender equality, because when women are more successful in the labor market, have more power, earning capacity, that confers a lot of other benefits. That can mean that women have more say over spending, and so there's more equity in healthcare. It can mean that families are going to want to educate daughters if they expect them to be working, and so we care about the labor market per se, but it's also maybe a way of unlocking gender equality in other domains. Okay, so I'm gonna, I guess my view on what does this mean for policy is that, very broadly speaking, we need to incorporate these norms or think about these norms if our goal is to improve women's employment outcomes. And we might want to do that both just to increase GDP. Even if we just cared about, if a government cared about GDP, helping women tap their potential in the labor market is valuable, but also from a point of view of equity. And so one approach is to sort of take the norm as given, say this is part of a society's current practices. We can't change that, but the labor market policy is going to have to be different in light of that norm. So that's what I'm saying is calling designing policies around the norm. And then another kind of approach is to say, part and parcel of helping women in the labor market is going to be to try to shift some of those restrictive norms. And so to illustrate those two approaches, I'm going to talk about two examples from my research in India, one in each of those cases. Okay, so the first is around overcoming restrictions on women's mobility. When I say mobility, I don't mean economic mobility, I mean physical mobility, being able to go out and about in your village or community. So this is a picture, it's actually from the New York Times travel section in November 2016. It's a momentous month, so it's easy for me to remember what month it is. And so this was a picture that was basically meant to illustrate the I guess the chaos, that's the colorful chaos of certain streets in India, where you see various modes of transportation and cows and everything that might be appealing for better or for worse in a New York Times travel picture. But what I was struck by, or what the exercise I did when I saw this photo, was to see how many women there were in this picture. So you can't always tell what gender someone is or what gender they present, but to my eye, I could only pick out 2 women out of about 40 people I could identify. And so this is both cause and effect of women's low employment. If this is a commuting time and there aren't many women working, you aren't going to see as many women on the road, but it's also just a deterrent to women working. If it just becomes more dangerous for women to be out and about or more uncomfortable, it's viewed as weirder if there are just very few women. And so one project with Rohini Pandey and Erica Field, both formerly of the Kennedy School, it was on trying to strengthen women's networks as a way to counteract their restricted mobility. And we specifically did this in the context of business training for women. So business training is a very common kind of labor force policy, active labor market policy for women, where a lot of women are self-employed. They're not running a big business. They might be their only employee. They don't have any employees, or they have one employee. But they're have to use management skills. They need to think about profits and losses and whether an investment is a good idea, et cetera. But many low-income women don't have, they don't have an MBA, they don't have the training in financial literacy and business skills. And so Seva Bank, which is Seva is a trade union, it's a well-known organization in Ahmedabad, India. They have a microfinance arm. So Seva Bank offered business training to its microcredit clients. And so what we did in this project is to evaluate whether that business training program, and specifically, a streamlined version that might be more scalable, whether it was effective in increasing women's profits and just the success of their businesses. The tweak we did to this is, in addition to having the normal business training arm of this randomized control trial, we had another arm where we said it's the same business training program, but women can invite a friend, a peer, to attend with them. So it had to be another woman. We said, someone who you think you talk to or is helpful to you in your business, and you could bring her with you. And so And then we have a comparison group. And our rationale for doing this was partly we thought it would increase attendance. If just going to the Save a Bank branch to attend this class that maybe other family members didn't know about was going to be a problem. Maybe if there was somebody to accompany you, you would be more likely to attend. Or it could also just reinforce the information. If you kind of practice the knowledge or talk about the knowledge afterwards with someone, then you're going to remember it and put it into good use. So what we found is that the training alone wasn't very effective. So here I could show you various outcomes. This one is just taking out a loan. Taking out a loan per se, you might not say is good or bad, but it's the first step towards expanding your business. And when we see a similar pattern to what I'm showing you here for all of our outcomes. So if you just the training alone, so this light purple bar versus the gray bar, that difference is not statistically significant. There's an increase, but doesn't seem like a big one. So, this 2-day, this short training might not have been enough. You might take from that it's just not enough material. But what we did find is this darker purple bar in the arm where women could bring a friend, we did start to see the impacts that you would hope for. Women were more likely to take out a loan. When they took out a loan, it was more likely to be for a business purpose. Maybe one of the more striking outcomes we find is that women's identity changed in the sense when we asked them at our end-line survey, what their occupation was, fewer of them said housewife and more of them said business owner. And it affected the bottom line of their business profits. And so we don't have an amazing data, or we don't have a way of we didn't have sort of different arms testing different mechanisms to really nail why exactly it was more successful. What we can say is it wasn't because of attendance. Attendance was as high in either arm. And what it seems to have been is partly a story about aspirations, that when part of the training was to set a goal and try to of what you wanted for your business. And what we saw is when people were invited with their friend, they set a more ambitious goal. And so kind of women sort of aimed higher when they had a peer kind of coach or someone as a cheerleader alongside them. And so why is this kind of important? What is coming back to norms is that women aren't getting a lot of organic interactions with other women around their business. And so, policies need to think about how they can maybe jumpstart, so give women more opportunities to have people to learn from, or in this case, just to be some moral support to be more successful in their businesses. The second example I'm going to go through is a very recent project of mine trying to change adolescents' gender attitudes, which is in this different spirit of can we change these norms? And so the specific approach here was working with high school students. You could change anyone's attitudes, but the reason for focusing on high school students was twofold. One is just young people are probably more amenable to change, or have more malleable moral attitudes than older people. And also, schools are a really powerful venue for governments to try to reshape norms. So in this case, this is a collaboration with the government of the state of Haryana that wanted to have more female employment. It's broader than that. They wanted to have a less skewed sex ratio. That's both for human rights reasons, it's for practical reasons. But how as a government do you change what's in the hearts and minds of people? There are various ways. You can have radio campaigns or billboards, but schools can shape values. And so it was a discussion-based intervention designed and run by an NGO called Breakthrough, which does a lot of wonderful gender human rights work. And it was really about getting kids to think about and talk about gender equality in their society and whether they thought that it was right or wrong. And so, that was really the hypothesis. It wasn't very didactic. It was really about, having kids think about and discuss the human rights and economic arguments for gender equality with the hope that would change their attitudes and make them more supportive of equality. So there were 27 sessions over 2 years. It was taught during the regular school day, and it was both boys and girls in the program. Can I just do a time check? I forgot to set a timer. And
you have about 5 more minutes.
Okay, great. It was taught by Breakthrough with both boys and girls. And, there were a lot of different sessions, but kind of one that I use as my go-to example, because I think it's one where I could see how, even if you've lived for 12 years or 15 years, and in a society, you might never have really thought hard about these issues. So in one exercise, the students break into groups and discuss who does various chores in their house, and then they get back together and share what their group's answers are. And lo and behold, it's always the women and girls who do the cleaning and the cooking and all of the other chores. And then this was taught by the Breakthrough staff. So it was the government of Haryana allowed Breakthrough to kind of take over the classroom during the regular school day. And so the Breakthrough facilitator, would say, okay, so why are women and girls doing the cooking? And, usually someone would say, oh, women and girls are better at that. And then the facilitator would say, well, okay, if that's the case, like, why aren't women the cooks in restaurants, and trying to, kind of just make kids realize that there's some inconsistencies in their views, and make them realize that women might find it more fulfilling if she's an excellent cook, to cook for 500-person weddings or in restaurants. And you're leaving money on the table by not tapping those talents and allowing them to be fully used. So not everybody is going to be moved by this, and maybe even a few will have a backlash reaction, but the hope is that this will be a light bulb for some kids where they start to realize, okay, this doesn't seem to have a rationale, and it might be, immoral to have these restrictions on what women and girls can do. So we evaluated this intervention in a randomized trial in 314 schools. And we see a large impact on gender attitudes. So I'm not going to go into how exactly we measure attitudes and make sure these are real effects. But we see, for example, at baseline, 3/4 of boys say that boys should get more resources for education than girls. Over 50% of girls agree that boys should get more resources than girls. So lots of people are holding regressive attitudes. And we find that the intervention converted 16% of those regressive attitudes. So it didn't solve the problem, but I don't think many complicated problems can be solved by one intervention. So I consider that a pretty big dent in the problem. And I think what's even the most exciting part of this project is that the impacts are highly persistent, at least so far. We resurveyed the kids 2.5 years after the program had ended, and we still saw these same improved gender attitudes for both the boys and the girls. I think one point to make is, in terms of behavior change, it looks like there's larger behavior change for boys, which is, I think, because of the very nature of the problem, that boys have more power in society. So if you have changed attitudes, you also need to have some power to act on them. And so that means, in this setting, at least, maybe boys will see more impacts among the boys who are in the intervention rather than the girls, but we'll see. So we're hoping to do some follow-on surveys. We're going to do the next one in 2022, where we could start to see, was there less early marriage of the young women in the program? Did they stay in school longer? Eventually we'll be able to see, is there more female employment among the wives of the boys who were in the program once they're a little bit older and married? And we're also pursuing scale up by state governments in India. So this is also an exciting case of, where evidence and, some innovation where you're helping the government saying, okay, you could try this out and innovate, and we'll see, we'll take or leave it once you're done, where, that innovation with some strong evidence has impacted policy. So actually the neighboring state to Haryana of Punjab has decided to scale up this program taught by government teachers. So, taking a step back, I think the restrictive social norms mean we need to expand what we think about as labor market policies. We need to go beyond just the traditional policies of training and microcredit or girls' education. And other examples, there might be opening up bank accounts for women so they can control their earnings, making commute safer, women-only subway cars or buses, some psychological coaching to increase women's sense of self-efficacy and their aspirations. I think that norm change is difficult, but it warrants more policy attention. And I think, kind of two things that I think are, ripe for experimentation and innovation is just the acceptability of harassment in public. I think that, that mindset shift, if you can get it, could make a big difference in some settings. And then, the one that's true everywhere is trying to increase men's role in childcare and housework. So thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Seema. That was so interesting, and hearing about the work that you've done in India has been really illuminating. So we're going to open up for Q&A now, and you can put your questions in the chat, or you can use the raise hand function on Zoom. I'm going to start with a question. I was really interested in the work that you did with Sewa and seeing how the bringing a peer to the business training has really increased the likelihood of a woman taking out a loan after the training. I was wondering, in terms of scaling, because I know Sewa was very big on scaling up, if they've kind of integrated some of that and altered the way that they generally run business training models based on this finding.
Yeah, they didn't scale it up, and this was an earlier project where probably we as researchers were now one of the I think wonderful things that JPAL has done is really have policy staff that can kind of collaborate with researchers, and so that scale up of the second project I talk about wouldn't have happened if it were just me and my fellow researchers scaling it up. There's a whole team in JPAL in India that's doing it. So I think this was, it's partly our fault for maybe not doing the, pushing to scale it up. And honestly, the lesson is relevant, not just with SEVA, but there are a lot of other organizations that are doing similar business training. So I think I'm aware of like some ongoing projects where people have thought about, other ways of taking the lesson and trying to change, kind of not in a experimentation way, but just in a policy way, try to use it, like creating WhatsApp groups among women. So with technology, you don't need to necessarily like bring women together. You can try to connect them with technology, and so kind of other ways to get at the same idea of broadening or strengthening women's networks.
Great. It's really nice to see that there's an increasing norm of researchers and policymakers working together now that evidence-based policymaking is becoming so well respected in the field. Sarah, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. So Seema, I know that you're saying that there are future studies that you want to look into, but how might COVID have impacted some of the research that's been done, and then the future of these studies?
Yeah, so the one that's still ongoing, where we're kind of looking at long run impacts, is the second one, the one on gender, trying to change gender attitudes in Haryana. And so I guess there are two ways to interpret your question. One is, could we still do research in during COVID? And then the second is, how would COVID kind of interact with or affect what we would expect to find? So I'll answer the second one, because it's probably, my guess is it's what you were asking, and it's more interesting. But so I think, I don't know, I'm actually quite curious. I think one, and I don't think there's sort of economic theory or any discipline's theory to say which way it could go. One view is that having these women sort of feeling empowered, or just kind of thinking it's more wrong, say, to be married off early, might be especially important during COVID, where I think there's a real risk that it's an absorbing state to be pulled out of school. And so a lot of the reason there's still like quite high education for women in India, or part of the reason is just sort of an incarceration effect of, kind of keeping young women busy before they can be married. And so, I think if there were some disruptions in school, ideally you would still want the young women to be able to complete secondary school or complete college. But, there's a risk that, okay, well, yeah, now you're 19, it's time to get married or something like that. And so in that world, if like that pressure has gone up because of COVID, that's what I would expect in the control group, more early marriage because of COVID. Maybe this program is especially important. It's also possible it could go the other way, which is, absent COVID, you would have seen women able to finish college, but there were just financial pressures on family, and there was this sort of disruption of school where they weren't as excited, and so that we don't see impacts. And so that's always a kind of we often talk about external validity, and we think of that usually over space and geography, but it's also true for macroeconomic conditions, or just like what's going on in the world. And obviously COVID is a big thing that's been going on in these individuals' lives, all of our lives, over the last couple of years.
Thank you. Stuti, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Seema. This was really interesting. So I think thinking about restrictive social norms, I was wondering if you've looked into how they vary across different social groups, so whether we're looking at caste groups or class groups, whether the norms are pretty consistent across those or they differ. And if so, how they impact women employment or labor force participation rates in India?
Yeah, so in the first study I mentioned on business, on business training, we did look by caste or by the norms within caste or religious groups, and so there is a pattern in India where a lot of these norms are stronger among higher castes, among Hindus, among higher castes than lower castes. It's sort of a luxury good to say, I'm going to leave money on the table by not having women work, and that's, I think someone just put in this chat, that's part of, I didn't give the entire story of the U-shape, but one mechanism is that, like, as you get richer, if in general men would prefer white women don't work, you can't really afford to do that when you're trying to feed your family. But as you get richer, one of the things you might spend money on is indulging this preference that your wife doesn't work. And so that would suggest that, when you have the luxury of restricting women, you do it. And when for economic reasons, you don't have that luxury, you don't. And so that leads you to have lower castes have more female employment and fewer of these restrictions. So that's a kind of very economic, related way. There's another one, which is just that this is like some of these caste norms, it's like, they're, kind of the sustaining this and creating these traditions is more true for upper caste. And so they just generally, kind of are more likely to have restrictions on women. But, the short answer is that the restrictions are bigger, for higher caste and Muslims in our setting in Ahmedabad. And therefore, a lot of the impacts I talked about were more pronounced for those groups because their starting point was worse.
Thank you. We'll go over to Sakina and then we'll take a question from the chat.
Hi. So you mentioned, Seema, how women may be restricted to, women have a restricted access to like social interaction in general because of social norms, and that may affect their learning about business skills. And I think from my experience working in sort of more rural setting where agriculture is a dominant economic production form, I think that also could be kind of true. I feel like sometimes female farmers are not so knowledgeable of different kinds of seeds and all that kind of stuff. And I think that has kind of an implication to production. And I was wondering if, that kind of research direction is that like a promising researching direction, or is that sort of a crowded area? And I was wondering what your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I think it's very interesting. So I think on agricultural extension, there has been, so a lot of the research I'm aware of, and I don't know as much about work in agriculture, and a lot of this is in sub-Saharan Africa rather than in India, but a lot of it has been, on kind of like communication between husbands and wives about information and, how you should tailor agricultural extension. So meaning like the education that's done on new agricultural seeds or new seeds or other technologies, like whether you should involve the women or just the men or them together, or, is it working when you're just involving men, which is traditional. And, there's another one, which is like peer learning. And so I haven't seen as much research that thinks about kind of peer learning with women. My colleague Laurie Beeman, I think, has some related research, but I'm trying to think of I don't know off the top of my head the gender angle on that. But I think it is, I think it is equally applicable. I guess a lot of occupations where you're just, the nature of your job is you're not working in a big team, you're going to have less interaction, and that interaction is just valuable socially, but it's also just valuable for learning. And so I kind of think anything like a self-employed woman, and I didn't mention a lot of these self-employed women in India are working at home, it's like home-based, making incense sticks or, cigarettes or, and so they're kind of isolated. And so the same thing might be true if you're, a subsistence farmer where you're just not interacting with people in the workplace. And so I think a lot of the same ideas are relevant.
Thank you. Sohi?
Yeah, thank you. I think my question is kind of related to this. Like, I found your the U curve that you showed as a variation to be a very good initial starting point for me. And I'm looking at India, and that was a really good example of how these interventions could help empower women and have them think about themselves in a different way, like the identifiers that you talked about. But I'm really curious about whether you've done research or know of other researchers, maybe in like sub-Saharan Africa, where you talk about how like in these low-income countries where agriculture is more of the main business activity, that these home chores and the agriculture are kind of more adjacent to each other. So in those cases, I think I know of a lot of like these African women who naturally think of themselves as like businesswomen in those contexts. In those kind of contexts, like how would these interventions play out in a similar way or differently from the research you've done?
Yeah, so I think in most measures of restrictive norms or women's outcomes, sub-Saharan African is going to look better than India, and there's higher participation in agriculture, than in India. So women are kind of more like a larger breadwinner in families in that way. And it's hard to know whether that's like the norm started out better and that's why women were working, or it's there are various other explanations researchers have found evidence for, like which is it's partly related to kind of land availability or just kind of the nature of agricultural production. So there's a whole complicated story of what are norms affecting the agriculture, or is it vice versa? But it is true that there's more parity. That being said, there isn't equity in in most decision making or most outcomes, even in sub-Saharan Africa. So I think with all interventions, you'd want to tailor them to different settings, and maybe there are some different ones that are are necessary. So I think for example, the just sort of, I think like a lot of interventions I've seen in sub-Saharan Africa are around women's empowerment and looking for outcomes in terms of use of condoms in outside of marriage. With there's just less premarital sexual activity in India than in sub-Saharan and Africa, and so in that sense, like that big topic of like how do you empower women so that they very young women so that they're not that they have power to kind of protect themselves from sexually transmitted diseases or pregnancy when they don't want to get pregnant, is something that's like very relevant in sub-Saharan Africa and not in India. So I guess my short answer to this is that I think that the problem is sort of different in kind and maybe in degree too. And, but I think broadly, like these norms, there are norms kind of everywhere that probably need to be tackled or worked around to bring up women to parity, even in sub-Saharan Africa.
Thank you so much. Arunduti?
Hi, Seema. So my question is a little bit around what are natural enablers that could be used in India, because I think these norms are so entrenched that they often seem like a very uphill battle, right, to design and execute any of these interventions. So especially in Indian society today, are you seeing any opportunities of things that are already happening that could then be a good, ground for civil society or policy actors to seize that this change is happening? Let's try and now build on top of that.
Yeah, so when you say, kind of things that are happening already, do you mean like other policies or just like phenomena that are happening?
Phenomena and policies, yes.
Okay. Yeah, I think there's been research, I guess another former Kennedy School faculty, Rob Jensen, where he looked at what happened when back office processing, call centers or transcription, when those jobs became available in India, and, found that like in the spirit of when you're leaving more money on the table, when the economy is starting to have this transformation where women are better at these jobs or are on equal footing with these jobs, that's like a moment to try to, maybe his work wasn't on trying to kind of actively shift the norms. It was about the fact that, when those jobs came about, young women stayed in school longer, they delayed marriage, presumably because, and their parents went along with this, presumably because now the returns to doing that were higher in terms of potentially getting one of these, jobs in Bangalore or wherever it was. But I think those are also just good moments, when people are maybe going to be a little bit receptive to these ideas because it's already been in the back of their mind, and those might be push times to do a big push to try to change those norms. I think there are also I think just in terms of, say, there are moments where things are in the news, like the rape case, where when that's in the news, I think that becomes a moment where you can have some policy leverage to talk about having women only buses or women only subway cars, or what more needs to be done to change those norms. So I guess there are sort of positive and negative moments that you can seize.
Thank you so much. I think we have time for one more question if anybody is still out there with a question. Okay, well, thank you so much, Seema, for such a thought-provoking discussion. This has been really great. And just as a final reminder to everybody, our next speaker series is on Friday, December 3rd at 12 p.m. with the Chief Impact Officer of Harambee Youth Employment Accelerator in conversation with CID and World Bank expert Eliana Carranza. The discussion will focus on inclusive employment for South African youth, and we hope you'll join us.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.